Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation about love, lust, and libido, which we'll be talking about aphrodisiacs in medieval Europe. And I'm Ken Albala, professor of history at the University of the Pacific in Stockton, California, and food historian. And so obviously we're going to be talking about aphrodisiacs that are foods, not just aphrodisiacs in general. And with me is Larissa.
So I'm Larissa Golemond. I'm assistant curator of medieval and Renaissance manuscripts here at the Getty Museum, or here virtually at the Getty Museum. So let's go ahead and get started. Ken, will you put us in the mood by starting to talk a little bit about the history of aphrodisiacs?
Yeah, so as you people probably know, every single food at some point in history has been labeled an aphrodisiac. In some culture, at some time or place, there's scarcely anything that someone hasn't claimed is going to be good for sexual performance or whatever. And then what that means is that the secondary literature is kind of all over the map. You can make an argument that anything is going to stimulate you. But I found it as sort of helpful to discuss what medieval people thought would be an aphrodisiac, how they kind of classified it, just to give you a brief taxonomy, because it's actually very different than the way we think of it. Today we think, okay, there's drugs that will help your performance. There are drugs that help fertility. We very rarely take food seriously. A few people are researching, oysters and how that, contributes to sperm production and things like that. But really, we don't take food seriously as an aphrodisiac anymore, or we say it's alleged to, or if you're in the mood, it may help. But we don't scientifically care about that. In the past, they did very, very seriously, and they had slightly different ways of categorizing things, so that a food might be very nourishing, and we'll see that that's the real criterion for why something is an aphrodisiac, and I'll explain that all the way through. But sometimes it could be something that increases sperm, causes it to flow, will increase desire, will increase performance, will increase conception. And that's what, of course, what the medical literature is most interested in. And they lump those all together. They're not really separate. We would never put Viagra and, fertility drugs in the same category. They have totally different functions. In the Middle Ages, they kind of stuff them all together, but they do mention specific foods and what they are very good at doing. And we'll go into some of the details of that today. But let me sort of give you a beginning, an introduction to humoral theory, because I don't think any of this stuff is going to make sense until you kind of understand the way people used to speak about primary qualities and secondary qualities. So what we have here is a little schema of the four humors. Now, let me explain what those are. So just as there are four elements in the universe, according to Empedocles, there are also four fluids that correspond inside our bodies that will have an effect upon us. So we could say that there is a sanguine humor, which is blood. Okay, blood, the majority of what's inside of us is blood. There's also a phlegmatic humor, if you look down in the lower right-hand corner, which is the phlegm in your mouth, it's the moisture in your brain, in your joints and everything. There is a choleric humor, or a choler, or which is the Greek word. We would call it bile, or yellow bile. And there's also melancholia, or black bile, which is the smallest amount, but each of those is very essential to maintaining health. And in fact, the physicians like Hippocrates and Galen would have described health as a balance of these four humors, not in quantity, but in intensity, meaning that if your makeup was somewhere in the middle of that chart there, if you had an equal strength of those four humors, it was called eucrasia, or good health. Now, the thing is that just as we have these four humors that regulate our health, all foods are also categorized as hot and moist, or cold and moist, or hot and dry, or cold and dry. And so they will, and it's not that the things themselves are say hot, but it's the effect that they have on our bodies. So for example, when you say chili is hot, well, what you're speaking really there is humoral theory, right? It's not that it doesn't burn your tongue, heat-wise, it does with the effect. When we say a martini is dry, we're really saying that it's styptic, it dries out your tongue. It's obviously a liquid, it's not dry. So when I'm speaking of these, when they're speaking of these things, this is about the effect that it has on your body. So a food that is very sweet, for example, will be considered hot and moist. Most meats are somewhere in that category. Obviously, sugar is there too. Why they thought sugar was an ideal food, very, very healthy. Things that burn on your tongue or things that are salty are usually considered hot and dry, or choleric. They will increase choler in your body. They will actually even make you angry, right? Because there's a kind of psychosomatic effect of the, elements in the food that will influence you. Things that are watery, that are sort of, cold and moist, things that are don't have a whole lot of flavor. Cucumbers are in that category. Melons, things that most fruit are there actually. Those things are very useful if it's a hot day, let's say, and you're physically hot and dry. This will be useful for rebalancing your humors to drag you back toward the center. And on the same note, the foods that are acidic or styptic or acerbic, those are all considered cold and dry. So every single food is categorized this way, but in general, foods, this is just sort of the base. Everything I'm going to say that will follow really has to do with the heat and moisture, the confluence of heat and moisture, things that are nutritious, and everything is that is nutritious is increases your libido. And let me explain how this works, because I have to sort of take you through a whole secondary set of factors, because the humors are not the whole story. The other side of the story is how difficult a food is to digest. What's its texture or qualities? In other words, how if you get a lot of exercise, you can digest things that are really tough to, or crass is the word they use in English. If you have a
So it's really about the whole food. It's not just the flavor or the ingredients of a recipe, say, but it's really textures and temperatures and all of these things together.
That's absolutely right. And it's about your own digestive capability. So if you are very delicate and don't get a lot of exercise, you can't digest something like beef. It'll corrupt before it goes in your body. And if you do get a whole lot of exercise, if you eat something that's very light and delicate like pheasant, it's going to burn up before it gives you any nutrition. And that's totally missing from our nutritional theory. Nowadays, we think, you put food in, it goes, you get all the nutrition. They
Right.
thought exactly the opposite. And some things like say a peach tends to go corrupt if you eat at the end of a meal, it will corrupt before all the other food gets digested. So fruits and vegetables are really not very good for you, and they're not very nutritious either, right? So, and we'll see that when we talk about anaphrodisiacs, that usually it's salad. Salad is the food of penitence.
I
So
mean, I agree.
well,
Most of us would agree that salad is a food of penitence.
so, let me
Maybe not in LA.
take you through the sort of so imagine food goes into your mouth and it gets broken, and digestion for them was not just what takes place in your stomach, it's the whole entire system. And what they would have called assimilation, meaning ideally the food goes in your mouth, the food that is closest to your body is the easiest to assimilate. So meat is actually the most nutritious thing by that logic. Wine is the thing that converts into your blood most easily, and obviously that's got religious significance also. And so the food goes into your body, into your stomach, it's broken down, the wastes are removed, it goes into your liver, and then it goes to where it becomes blood or other humors, and then it goes into your body. It's actually assimilated into the parts of your body. And if you are healthy and well exercised and well balanced in your humors, the excess nutrition gets stored as sperm. And the thing is, and that actually stimulates your libido. Now, ancient people, I'm talking mostly about Galen here, believe that both men and women had sperm. It's not that they were stupid. Let me explain the logic of this. Obviously, they didn't have microscopes, so they couldn't have looked, at these and told the difference. But in their minds, men and women were actually two forms of the exact same sexual reproductive system. If a person was very healthy and well nourished and emotionally stable, at the point of conception, you would have a fully complete human being that would turn into a boy, would have external genitalia. And if something were wrong, if the mother were cold or badly nourished or something, emotionally disturbed, the parts wouldn't be fully formed and the genitalia would remain inside. So they believe both men and women had a kind of sperm, and the food, and you'll see consistently through the medieval medical literature and all the way up until the 18th century, foods that are very nutritious are the ones that are going to stimulate your libido most powerfully. And if you're interested, and so that's just sort of the underlying theory. Now, there's a whole lot of exceptions. There's some things that accidentally stimulate or cause some other kind of thing to happen. But let me just sort of give you a few examples of what a medieval um, text about aphrodisiacs would include, the sort of details that are, you know, well, let me give you the one person. There's Magninus Mediolanensis, or Mino de Mineri, who's died in 1368. So he's kind of contemporary to where we're talking about here.
Mhm.
And I love him because he actually wrote a book on sauces. The Oporgos,
A man after
Seporgos.
my own heart. I do love a
Opus.
good dip.
It's a great culinary text. So he will say that, for example, arugula or mustard are hot and dry in the 3rd degree. Mustard is hot and dry in the 4th degree. So you can see on that sort of chart where that would be, plotted. And his logic is that if you eat something like pork, you want to combine it with mustard so that the effect is, so that the phlegmatic humors that are in pork will be corrected. And ultimately that will become an aphrodisiac food. Spices have the same effect, right? They're both also hot and dry. They burn, ginger, pepper, burn on the mouth. And then let me just show you how Galen's logic, as it passes through the Arab authors like Avicenna and Averroes and Rhazes, gets translated from Greek to Arabic to back to all the way to Latin. It had never been in Latin. And then it gets picked up by people like Magninus. So this is just a passage that talks about it. So coitus, following the truth, is useful in the expulsion of superfluities of the 3rd digestion, where it's used in a regimen of health, meaning that he would prescribe sex for people who had eaten very well, were well nourished, and they're beginning to get sick. He prescribes
So it's all about balancing things, right? So you want to have a little bit of this, a little bit of that, keeping everything right in the middle.
Exactly. Well, yeah, and let me just finish the passage. He says, it's a danger if coitus is not expelled. It putrefies and converts into a kind of venom and causes the worst illnesses and even death. So these authors were very, very kind of open about discussing these topics, especially about conception and about why, the role that sex had in that whole schema of maintaining your humors and staying healthy and keeping a balanced constitution.
Sure.
Let me just mention one other guy. This is Benedetto Riguardati, who's is exactly contemporaneous with Jacquard. And he's of interest because the figure we're going to talk about, the Amadeus, his daughter goes to Milan, marries into the house, the ducal house there, and Benedetto is brought in to look at her fertility. They wanted her to conceive very badly, and apparently she was having trouble, so they brought her in. And they brought him in to consult, and he has some very specific recommendations, and the logic of what he's saying, I think, will be revealing here. So he says, garlic, if eaten in moderation, will excite coitus. That's the polite way he says it. So he says, don't let her overdo it. She's going to overheat if she has garlic. But mint, for example, is hot and dry and helps coitus on account of inflation. And I'll talk about what that means in just a bit. It's one of those kind of accidental causes of an aphrodisiac working, not because it's nutritious. Eggs, he says, the nature, if the coitus has caused debility, it will restore you. And eggs are really easy to digest. They're very nutritious. That's the logic of that. Oysters, and I should point out here, everyone thinks, oh, they said oysters because they're similar to I don't know what, and they said carrots or parsnips because they look like genitalia. Absolutely not. That's not the logic at all. He tells us oysters are nourishing and fattening and restorative, and they augment the material of coitus. Now, what he's saying there is that this is not something that's inherently nutritious, but its similarity to the sperm itself will actually assimilate and become aid in the production of sperms. So this is in general what's called the theory of signatures. I think you really find it far more in the early modern period, by the 17th century, but it's there, is that the shape of something, the walnut to the brain, for example, asparagus to a penis, I guess, but that is much rarer than people assume. They think, oh, it's, this shape, it's phallic shape, so therefore it must be an aphrodisiac, and that's usually not the logic at all. The logic tends to be a lot weirder, and a lot more interesting in my mind,
And
because
often sort of almost counterintuitive to the way we tend to think about foods today. Because, for example, I would say that we would tend to think of mint as a cool food, but really in the medieval conception, you would think of it as a hot food.
yes, mint is hot and dry in their
Interesting.
minds. And in fact, you're not supposed to sow mint at times of war, according to Aristotle, because the soldiers will get distracted, I guess, or something like that. Um, so as I said, there's a few other types of aphrodisiac that don't follow this idea that just because it's nutritious, it will increase sperm, stimulate libido, and then work. This one of inflation is kind of weird, because what we're imagining in our minds is, like one of those little squeeze toys where you squeeze on the body and then all the parts bulge out. It's like a stress toy, and so that's not what they're thinking at all. Inflation, what they're saying is that if a food causes wind, if it causes flatulence, it's not that your whole body is going to inflate. It's that the food will then pass into your stomach, and that quality will go there. It'll pass into your liver, that quality will go there. That part will go into the parts of your body, and they will be in the last part of digestion, which is the assimilation into your members, literally. That will cause it to cause an erection, but it will not cause conception. It's not good for increasing the material of coitus, as they would say, but it's good as Viagra, I guess. It's good for performance, right? Two totally different things.
Right.
Um, Likewise, if something is salty, that may cause a prurient itch, as one of my authors claimed, but it doesn't mean it's going to be good for conception, and therefore, or engendering good children. That's the other thing. You want to be very well nourished. Saltiness will make you salacious. I mean, the word from Latin, salaritas, means just being horny, right? And then there's the idea that well, there's dozens of other sort of minor ways that can stimulate, but I think most of them are really very secondary to the idea that foods that are nutritious will lead to production of sperm that will signal your libido, and then you are ready to reproduce. Okay.
All right. Well, so we have a little poll for people who've been paying attention to what kinds of foods cause the enhancement of libido or not. So we have our first poll. If you would like to dampen the libido of your guests, say you want to really host a lame party, what would you serve at your next medieval feast? So the possible answers are spinach, almonds, ginger, and beans. So go ahead and vote in the poll now, and we'll see if it makes humoral sense to serve any of these things at your next meal.
Okay. So should we go on to why people didn't want to be stimulated?
Of course.
Because interestingly, the literature recommending aphrodisiacs is not as rich as the literature saying don't eat this because it's going to stimulate you. And if you can think of the type of person who would want to do that, it's obviously clergymen and ascetics and people who and actually even ordinary people too, for fast days. Now, what's really interesting is obviously Christianity at the very beginning didn't have any dietary regulations, meaning that they wanted to distance themselves from Judaism, and so they said no kosher laws, no circumcision, no things like that. But laws came in anyway, and they did specifically for fast days, fasting meaning not total abstinence from food, but abstaining from meat. And I think that most people don't quite understand the logic is those first early churchmen writing about fasting, like Tertullian, like St. Jerome, like Clement of Alexandria, they were Roman people, right? I mean, their mental mindset was the exact same as Galen's. They would have
Mhm.
known that theory. And for someone who wants to prevent the libido from being stimulated, don't eat meat. Don't eat things that are nutritious. Eggs, absolutely out. Cheese, milk, any animal products. But fish are fine. Fish are not nutritious, right? They're cold and moist. They're not gonna make you, horny. And vegetables are absolutely. So for days when you want to be penitent, um, it is best to eat vegetables and fish and cold things. And for obviously for Lent, for the vigils before Saint days, for any time that you want to be penitent, avoiding meat is the answer. And this became not just a choice; this became the law. I mean, this was standard. You could get arrested if you were serving meat during Lent or selling it, especially. And so, a different kind of food limitations came in, and I think the effect that it has is really sort of feast or fast. That some seasons people will be eating to excess and trying to stimulate their libido, as we'll see in the recipes from Shikart, and other times they were trying to be completely penitent, and they didn't go so far as sackcloth and ashes on their head. But for ordinary people who couldn't really, couldn't, like Jesus, fast for 40 days, they would just avoid meat for those days, and sex, presumably, right? That's the ultimate goal, is that you're so the poll is very interesting because
Yeah, I was going to say, so to quench the, or to, turn people off at your next feast, you should in fact serve spinach.
you're absolutely right. That's it. And beans also. Beans, because they're hard to digest, right?
Sure.
But no, ginger, absolutely not. Ginger hot in the mouth, that's gonna excite you. Remember in Falstaff says ginger will be hot in the mouth. That's a stimulant. And almonds are a stimulant also because they're very nutritious. So um so the I guess
So
let's,
I was
one
going to
other
say,
thing I want to just mention, if
oh,
you
sure,
want to
sure.
sort of understand the mindset of these people who were ascetics, I want you to picture like these people who've just taken vows of celibacy, who are meek, downtrodden, whatever it may be, and they're looking at all the other people who are enjoying sex, having fun, eating meat, and I think it's sort of born out of spite. I think that they're kind of rabid anti um, status to their statements against sex come from the fact that they can't get it right, is that
Right.
they're not allowed to have it, and so they make it a sin, and the idea is that, well, you may be enjoying life now, but in the afterlife we're going to be sitting on the edge of the clouds looking down on you and laughing because we've made it into heaven and you haven't.
Well, to that end, I mean, thinking about the way that the sort of settings in which medieval people might have enjoyed feasting rather than fasting, I wanted to show this image. This is actually from a manuscript of Augustine's City of God, which you wouldn't necessarily expect to have scenes of hot tub dining necessarily. You can see here people in tubs eating meals, often in mixed genders, it looks like. And so Augustine's text actually presents human history as a conflict between what he calls the earthly city and the city of God. And this image actually accompanies a passage about the corrupted customs of the Romans. So there's scenes from a public bath, and then in the couple in bed is actually supposed to be a brothel scene. So this is all of the stuff that you shouldn't be doing, really, if you hope to gain admittance to the city of God. Um, and so there's an interesting, I think, tension in what we can see in the medieval visual material with what is actually being practiced in food culture. So we see people indulging here, having these public baths with food and indulging in sex, which of course is not good for Augustine. But of course, this is a reality of life. People were definitely indulging in baths and sex and all of these other things. So I think it's what you're saying is an interesting balance between this idea of feast culture and sort of excessive culture, and then fast culture, sort of reining things in a little bit too. So this is also happening in life, not just food culture, but the way that people are conducting themselves as well.
Absolutely. And I think we, in order to accompany this whole talk, we chose a cookbook that comes from this period. by Chicard d'Amixo, who was the chef to the Duke of Savoy at the time. Savoy was this, state between France and Italy, those modern states, and with his capital in Chambéry. The Pope, I'll tell you how he became Pope, but he was ruthlessly ambitious. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The state had just become a duchy, actually. I think it was a county before that.
Mhm.
And the Pope who was elected before, actually, there'd been a schism, and there were, at point, one Pope in Avignon, one in Rome, then there was a third Pope in Pisa. And so the
It was
Council of
total
Constantinople,
chaos. I mean, popes everywhere.
like, let's have a Pope convention. So they re-elected Martin V, and when Martin V died, there was again two popes, and one was backed by England, the other by France, basically. So this guy who was the Duke became Pope. He's the last of the anti-popes. So right before this happened, 1420 is actually when the manuscript comes from. Chicard wrote this cookbook, which exists only in one copy left in Sion in Switzerland, that describes absolute incredible amounts of food. I mean, it's just stunningly grotesque at a certain point, because obviously he's inviting people. But let me just give you an idea. He's so Chicard is not a cook. He probably did cook. He probably worked his way up through the kitchens, but he was the banquet manager. So he has to do all the ordering, buy everything, design the menu, provide the entertainment. I mean, it's hire the carvers, whatever it may be. So he says, first, this is just one day, the provisions for a day: 100 fat cattle, some 130 sheep, also fat, 6 score of pigs, furthermore, for the day of the banquet, 100 small piglets, both for roasting and for other uses, and 6 large fat pigs salted for larding and stewing. And it just goes on and on. There's just a grotesque amount of food. Now you wondered, this seems sort of weird, because there's a guy who becomes Pope, isn't he? Apparently he did keep the, very strict fasting rules at court. So he'd
So
go
we
from
actually
one.
have a photo. Can we go to, I'm sorry to interrupt, just slide 11. We have an actual photo of the manuscript that Ken is talking about. It's dated from 1420. And this is the actual manuscript that all of the recipes that are associated with today's event. If you didn't see those, there's links in the event page on the Getty's website. Please go watch the videos, because they're very entertaining. Ken was kind enough to put together some instructional videos. And from what I've heard, the food is very good. And yeah, Ken, as you're saying, so we know Amadeus VIII as the anti-pope Felix V, but before he sort of retired to a life of religious introspection and was elected anti-pope, he had this really magnificent court in Savoy. And so we know of these epic banquets that he's throwing. And from Chicard actually records the marriage banquet between Amadeus VIII and Mary of Burgundy. So an actual feast that actually occurred. And to kind of get a sense of what that feast might have looked like, we have a couple of other manuscript images here. And this is actually an image that's from a manuscript that tells of the exploits of the ancient king Alexander the Great, but it's been updated visually, so medievalized into basically the 15th century. And so we can get a sense of what 15th century feasts might have actually looked like. So all of these courtiers sitting around this huge table, epic tableware, and what looks like maybe some lamb or pheasants on the table and these big dishes, or a little dog. But you can also get a sense of how fancy a feast like this might have been. So people in these really amazing costumes, and over on the side of the image, you can see this this kind of sideboard with all of these other vessels. So really fine silver, tableware. These would have been really incredible events. People serving, people attending, people eating, often dancing and music. And so kind of getting ourselves in the mindset of a medieval feaster when we're sort of thinking about Chicard. These are also some additional images, actually both from other manuscripts telling of the exploits of Alexander. And again, you can see these really elaborate tables, all of these really elaborate fabrics. And you can always tell who the most important person in the meal is here. So they're seated in the middle. In the image on the left, you can see Alexander seated underneath this really fancy canopy, kind of showing how important he is. And all of these different people kind of milling around the banquet, women wearing furs and all of these fine brocades and damask fabrics. And so when we're thinking about a court like the Duke of Amadeus of Savoy and Chicart sort of having to rise to the occasion of creating just an epic meal. But it's not just about creating an epic meal, right? It's all about what ingredients you're using. So maybe you can talk a little bit about the recipes from Chicart's cookbook that you are highlighting for this event.
Sure. I'd love to also point out that in these images, notice what's missing. There's no forks. There's no, there's a knife. One of them had little square metal trenchers, but here they're just slices of bread. The food goes on. Everything else is just eaten with their fingers. If you wanted a drink, someone brought you the drink and then you did take the cup away. So anyway, so look at the text here very closely. It says encore plus en chaud. It's very easy to read, actually. It's this French. It's in a secretary hand. But let me give you I think what's the translation here? Is this the Rizol one? I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. Encore risol et pour donner entendement à celui qui fera. So the Risols to instruct a person who'll be making them. So this is the banquet manager telling the person what's going to be made. And it goes on. He's obsessive about cleanliness. So any sort of ideas you might have about filthy medieval people, he is obsessed with cleanliness of the pots, the cleanliness of the bowls and everything, the cleanliness of the pig. So this is a rossiol is what he calls it, but a risol is it's really a little pie. It's not a croquette, so to speak. And the parts that are put together, there's one guy who does the pastry separately. There's another guy, and having done these, this was a long recipe to cook. It took a good hour to put together a handful of them. Imagine serving 10,000 of them, and there's gold on it too. So he's clearly trying to impress so much. And the people who I should mention also the time when this is written, 1420. Remember that the English had just beaten the French in Agincourt, and the French are kind of out of the picture. England is preoccupied. Savoy kind of fills in this power vacuum, allied to the Kingdom of Burgundy, was under Charles the Good, supposedly the most elaborate court at the time. So he's spending a lot of money on expensive things.
Oh, yeah.
And the spices especially come from the other side of the world. They
sure.
are aphrodisiacs. And the fact that there's gold on it and you're eating it, talk about conspicuous consumption, obviously.
I was just going to say, yeah, I would like to gild almost everything I eat, but I don't know if I could afford it.
So the spices that go into this are white ginger, grains of paradise, not too much, he says. Grains of paradise come from the coast of Africa, the west coast of Africa. And then saffron, which is obviously expensive then as now. And it's got all these fruits in there, the figs, the prunes, the dates cut up very fine. And it's really a very elegant food. We tend not to combine things that are sweet and savory in one dish, but this clearly is. And I think if you look at the way the combination of flavors also, the pork is nutritious, so it's going to be an aphrodisiac to start with, but it's slightly phlegmatic, so that you would want to balance that out with things that are hot and dry and sweet, right? Hot and moist things. That's where all those the figs and the prunes and the dates, all of that stuff comes in. It'll make it a more balanced, humorally. And it will stimulate everyone. I mean, this is nutritious food. It's not because there's any resemblance to genitals or anything like that. It's just that this is really good, nutritious food.
So we have here on the screen, just talking about pork. These are some images from medieval calendar pages. So these are in manuscripts that are actually devotional manuscripts that are used to facilitate private devotion, but they're really practical too. So they're a very popular kind of manuscript, and they often have these calendars that precede or that preface the book. And they list saints' days and all sorts of other practical information, but they often have these images that show what you're supposed to be doing at that particular time of year. And so I'm wondering when Chicart is serving pork if it's around in the wintertime or in the springtime, because we often have images of pork being brought into being, say pigs being slaughtered, boars being slaughtered as part of December calendar pages. So people getting ready for the long winter. You can see on the November calendar page on the left, this woman feeding the pigs. And then I have to say, the other images are a little heartbreaking. They're sort of, people with axes raised, or
Bludgeoning.
usually pork, pigs about to get what's coming to them. But thinking about the sort of immense amount of pork that it would have taken to feed a feast as big as the one that Shikart describes, and as many rissoles as they might have needed to serve all of the guests. But this kind of gives you a little bit of a window into the idea of pork in the medieval visual imagination as well. And you were talking a little bit about raisins and figs. We have the next slide, slide 13, please. These are images from this really fantastic manuscript. It's known as the Taquinum Sanitatis, which translates roughly to the maintenance of health. And this is a guidebook to keeping yourself healthy. So thinking back to the idea of humoral balance and eating certain kinds of foods. It survives in a lot of copies, illuminated copies from Northern Italy that have these amazing images that are kind of glimpses into how medieval people were serving food, harvesting food, thinking about food. And so these are raisins and figs at market stalls. And again, you can see this kind of the way that they might have been stored in these baskets. Ken, can you tell us a little bit about how raisins and figs would have figured into Shikart's meal and why you would want to eat them at certain times of year?
Yeah, they're all sweet, hot, and moist things, very nutritious, easily digested. Another sort of quality that is useful as an aphrodisiac are things that are aperitive, meaning they open the passages of your body. Obviously, they work as laxatives also, but they also aid in the flow of sperm. I know that sounds sort of weird, but a lot of things, the fruits and especially nuts. And then what about the pine nuts and chickpeas are the two things that you see most frequently that are not necessarily very nutritious, but they always will say these things augment the material of sperm, meaning that they are similar to them. Pine, I don't know, pine, maybe if you make pine milk out of it, there's some kind of similarity.
Well, it's
But
interesting that you mentioned that, though. So we do have that recipe that has almonds and spinach. So on the next slide, we can see some more images from the same manuscript of the harvest of spinach here. This woman carrying this really overflowing basket of spinach on her head, and then harvesting almonds. So I think we think of almond milk as almost a kind of a recent invention, or a sort of it's become popular in recent years. But here we can see people kind of knocking down almonds and gathering them. And the recipe that you made that combines spinach with almond milk, I have to say that's not a combination that I have ever thought of, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Oh my God, it's great. And I don't know what I was expecting, something like creamed spinach, I guess. But interestingly, it's in a section of the book for convalescence because it's very easy to digest. And normally almond milk would be used during Lent, right? It's a substitute for regular milk. The stuff you buy in the store, of course, is, there's very little real almond in there. It's mostly flavoring, but it's very easy to make. If you blanch almonds and then put them with hot water and pound them up, or use a blender, it's even easier, and then strain it, what you get looks, smells, tastes exactly like milk. It's uncanny. And what he has us do is cook the spinach dry, as standard procedure to this day, and parsley. So the parsley is actually hot and dry because it's a little bite to it, so it counteracts the cold of the spinach. That makes it more balanced. And then they're washed and they're chopped fine, and then there are a little almond oil is added. He gives you a couple of different options, but the one that I tried was with the almond milk goes in, and it becomes this cream of spinach that you can imagine, being a little sick and having something really comforting like that. But in general, spinach is an anaphrodisiac. Things that are cold, if you eat them on their own, especially if you don't go through that cooking them dry first to get off the superfluous moisture,
right,
and that will chill your libido immediately, almost as badly as lettuce. Lettuce is the worst. It's the coldest thing you could eat that is you want to kill the mood, start with a salad. That's it.
And so we had already talked a little bit about pepper. So on the next slide, you can see an image of the harvesting of pepper. This actually comes from a great manuscript of the Travels of Marco Polo, who's this famous explorer from Venice who goes around to the east. He's one of the first Europeans to travel the Silk Road and write an account of it. And you can see here this idea that pepper and these spices come from around the world, so they're extremely valuable as imported items. And so, would someone like Chicart sort of use pepper sparingly, or is this a food that people who are at the highest echelons of society, like Duke Amadeus, would they have easy access to this, or is this still something that is rare?
With wild, extravagant abandon, they would use pepper. Pepper is the most important spice, and interestingly, it's the only spice that still survives on the table today.
Hmm.
It's the only one that we would have a pepper shaker. We would never have cloves or nutmeg or
Sure.
galangal or paint of paradise on the table. And it's because they were really into heat. I know that sounds strange. They liked spicy things. They liked this combination of spice and sweetness and sour from verjuice, and sugar, of course, goes on everything, especially when you get to the 15th century. But they liked the heat of pepper. By this point, the Venetians really have a monopoly on it. 15th century, they're getting it. Obviously, it comes from India, the Malabar coast, goes all the way around with a dhow to the Mediterranean. The Venetians pick it up there, and then they transport it to the rest of Europe. By the time it gets there, it's wildly expensive, but that's the whole point. They want to
Yeah,
spend
exactly.
tons and tons of money, and it's slightly lascivious, right? I mean, people know that pepper is going to stimulate them. Things that are spicy are going to arouse them. That's standard in the medical literature. And it's why people who don't, during Lent, you generally don't use spices, and you don't drink
Yeah.
a lot of wine either, because wine is a direct analog of blood. It's going to stimulate blood production and the same. So
So we've gone through a couple of the ingredients that kind of feature in the recipes that we pulled out of Chicart's cookbook. We're wondering for people tuning in, if you made the recipes, what was your favorite one? So we have a poll coming up. You can vote for the pork rissoles, which I understand are sort of difficult and kind of a project to make. The spinach with almond milk, the hippocras, or the spiced wine, or you haven't tried the recipes yet, and we do encourage you to do that to get kind of a taste of what a 15th century feast might have actually tasted like. And if we go
let's
on,
talk about the hippocras then. I
sure,
guess
yeah. Let's go on to the next slide where we have some images of grape harvesting and winemaking, much the way that I think we imagine it today.
well, hippocras, we think that we add things to wine and it's adultery, ruining it. They loved putting spices in wine, and it was a stimulant, right? It's obviously, stimulating. You get a little drunk, you get a little loose, whatever. But they also figured that wine was very nourishing. It's a necessary nutrient. And so the hippocras, it's named for Hippocrates, but actually it's named for this sort of sack that you filter out the spices with. And what I found kind of fascinating is in the Chicart's banquet, he has a fountain of love, which is flowing. Spiced wine comes out of one side, and a rose water comes out of the other. I'm not sure, but I don't think they're drinking the rose water. I think
Just for the scent.
exactly. But the fountain of love is amazing. You have to stop and think, wait a minute, this is a guy who becomes Pope. What is a fountain of love doing there? Well, it refers to a poem by Guillaume Dufay, who was, well known as a composer too. He wrote this poem about this guy who is melancholy and wishes he falls in love with this woman. She's not there, and this guy comes, like a saint comes and convinces him that he can love her on a spiritual level, and it doesn't need to be fulfilled in a physical sense, that its spiritual love is just as good. And that's exactly what's happening right here in this picture. Is his monk friend is telling him, don't worry, you can still love, it's okay if it's not physical.
I love the envisioning of these fountains and these illuminated copies of some of the Fountain of Love text too, where you have this sort of very elaborate Gothic-looking structure that has, you know, carved figures in it, and the idea of courting couples, and really just over the top kind of ideas about the Fountain of Love. The idea that Amadeus the Eighth is actually having maybe something that looks a little bit like this at his court.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you can get a sense of just how elaborate the feast might have been. So we have most people voting for the Hippocras, the spiced wine. I agree with that. And for those of you who haven't tried the recipes yet, I do encourage you to go back because they're really, I mean, Chicard is interesting because the recipes are actually quite legible and pretty, I think,
Detailed. They're
you know,
really easy
yeah,
to follow. Yeah.
exactly. You can really get a sense of what medieval feasting might have been like around 1420 at this very, very elaborate court. And thinking a little bit about the idea of feasting, love, courting, we have a couple of additional images that I just want to go through quickly before we get to Q&A. So on the next slide, we have a couple of images that I think are just really fun of couples courting. Again, these are from calendar pages, so maybe you didn't know that courting is a springtime activity, but I think it makes sense, right? The idea of fertility, newness, youth. And so we have these very fancy couples here. The image on the left, a courting couple next to a man who's hawking. So obviously this is the purview of the elite class. And again, here I love this middle image that also has this idea of a fountain and lovers meeting at a fountain. And so I just wanted to show these because I think they're really fun. We're thinking about Valentine's Day and the beginning of spring and the idea of courting your beloved. Maybe on a horse ride through the forest. I don't know if anyone's doing that on Valentine's Day, but if you are, let us know. I would love to know. So we have this idea of the ideal of courting that we can see in these manuscript images. And then on the next page, there's this, again, the intrusion of what the church is actually teaching coming into contact with the reality of the situation. So this image I love to show because so we have this idea of the church mandated idea of love and sex and its depiction in manuscripts. So we have this image that was originally an image of Abraham and Hagar making love. And we have a later reader who is maybe a little bit scandalized by the image of that. And so kind of a later act of censorship where the reader has actually scraped off the offending image. A little too spicy for them, maybe. And so I think the last images we'll show are, again, kind of returning to this idea of bathtub dining. And again, the image on the left is from a luxury copy of the translation of Valerius Maximus, which is actually the same text that our banner image, the temperate and the intemperate, is taken from. And again, this is, it's hard to know if these kind of mixed gender baths are actually taking place because this is supposed to, again, be an illustration of the depravity of ancient pagans, ancient Romans.
Yeah, but the logic is actually medical. They believed that sperm was solidified like wax, and so that
sure.
it wouldn't get flowing unless you heated it and rubbed it, and and the bathtub helps it melt, and that's what helps the flow. So it's part of the whole dietary logic. And if you look at what they're eating, it's nutritious foods. They're eating chicken or something that's easily digested, and wine and nuts. This is a prelude to conception. I don't think that this was meant to be dirty or something. I think this is
in some manuscripts. I think it is meant to illustrate the sort of like pagan practices of the Romans, but these images are always updated in terms of like contemporary visual culture. So we have this really fancy like 15th century interior with this really elaborate stone fireplace, this really elaborate canopied bed. We know that medieval people were bathing, of course. That's a sort of persistent myth about the Middle Ages. So we do have surviving big wooden tubs like this. Whether or not people were taking full meals in the bath, we don't know. Maybe. I mean, I think we can imagine very elite people doing things like this. I love the look on the servant's face, which is just like so bored looking
I
and
know.
just like so over it. Like
Again,
she's
right. Well,
bringing new water for the bath,
they look
so
like
funny.
they're different ages in that picture, that maybe he needs some help, right? I
Maybe,
don't know.
maybe.
But people, these are all over the place. These images of people in the bathtub eating, and sometimes it's a whole crowd of people. Like it's
Sure,
clearly an
yeah.
establishment that does this. So people just come in as couples and all get in and eat in the eat in the tub naked. And there's a
So
bed in the background, so they're clearly
sure, yeah.
supposed to do it afterwards, right?
So we have our last poll. Our final poll is bathtub dining planned in your Valentine's Day. And maybe you want to take into account the idea of this balanced menu that we put together. So we have meat to stimulate your libido, and spinach to cool it down, and maybe spiced wine to wash it all down. So I think we have some time for a couple of questions. So if you've put something in the Q&A, or if you have a question, please go ahead and have that.
Well, I hope
Um,
there'll be a poll after everything to let us know if these things worked.
yeah,
Right?
definitely. Yeah, let us know how the recipes go for you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions here. Um, could you tell us a little bit more about foods that might cause accidental stimulation?
Yeah, the things that are that it's usually things that they tell you to avoid, and spices are usually in there. Salty things like sardines and anchovies will cause a prurient itch, as one author says, and you should avoid those if you unless you want to be lecherous. And it's why they serve them in taverns, right? People say, oh, it's to increase your thirst, so you drink more. That may be the case, but it's also those are the things you find with if you look at Shakespeare with Sherisac, it's always plague on this pickled herring. So salty foods are unnatural, and so are turnips. That's the other one that I've just always found amazing because they're not very nutritious. They cause flatulence, and so they inflate the whole body accidentally and don't necessarily make good procreation, but they're good for distension.
Mhm.
Now, why they don't say that about beans, I don't know, and I think it's because beans are just difficult to digest.
I
Whereas,
mean, turnips are not exactly great. I don't know if
well,
anyone's a great turnip fan. I don't mean to offend anyone. Um, let's see. What role did alcohol or wine more specifically play into the whole mix? So, is wine or alcohol something you would have at every meal, just sometimes, a mix of the two, depending on what you needed to stay balanced?
wine is a necessary nutrient, absolutely, every day. It's part of the sacrament, so you have to take it to be saved in the mass. And people, there's this impression that the water was not clean, so people drank alcohols, and obviously ordinary people drank water. Of course they did, but if you could
Sure.
afford not to, absolutely you drink beer if you were in Northern Europe over water any day, just because it doesn't go bad. But wine is really for, unless you live in a wine region. If you live in the South, there's cheap wine everywhere. If you're in the North, you import wine and spend a lot on it. Right? And sweet wine. This is the other thing. They loved sweet wine. They loved white, sweeter wines. Um,
Sure. Can you speak a little bit more to the use of gold leaf? Was it perceived as nutrition, or is it simply
yeah.
a beautiful addition?
So gold does not corrupt, right? And it will help preserve your body as a result. Now, what they didn't realize, I guess they didn't examine, is it goes right through your system. You don't digest it. It just goes right out into your poop, and it's such a fine gold leaf. It's a quarter, millionth of an inch hammered out thin. But they believed, and they tried drinking it also. There's something called aurum potabile, which is drinkable gold that was supposed to help in longevity. Longevity is a totally different topic than the libido, but I don't know why was Shikart using it. It's because they could, because it was expensive. They could really impress
Yeah,
people. And if you
exactly.
put it
These
in a bid to become pope, you want to show you've got the money. Right?
Yeah, exactly. No, I love the idea of gilding food just for aesthetic effect too. I mean, you can imagine the sort of platters overflowing with these things all gilded. How spectacular that would have been
Incredible.
for guests and sort of the overall impression of them. Let's see. Let's see what else we can answer here. Let's see. Are there other non-nutritious metals or gemstones that were thought to be beneficial to consume? So any non-food things that would have been
Yeah.
maybe used as aphrodisiacs or ingested for other reasons.
Yeah, there's actually a recipe in Shikar also for gemstones made into a broth. Now, it's complete nonsense. I mean, obviously they're not going to have any effect. And people used to also dissolve pearls into in Messisbugo, whose early 16th century has recipes for coral and pearls dissolved into food, presumably for therapeutic benefit. But yeah, there's a really strange uh, restorative broth made out of emeralds and rubies and things.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. Let's see. We have time for a few more questions. So yeah, if you want to ask a question, please go ahead and type them into the Q&A box. We have a lot, so we won't be able to get to all of them, but I'll try to get to some more. Let's see. Speaking a little bit more about shikar, is there anything in the cookbook that would strike us as very antithetical to the modern palate?
Okay.
or is it all sort of things
Yeah.
that we would still eat today, theoretically?
Well, I think sugar in the food in savory dishes we find a little off-putting unless we're thinking, oh, maybe it's if it's Moroccan, it's Bastilla. But their combination of foods sounds really strange, but when you think about something that is got a sour component, a sweet component, a spicy component, a savory component, it sounds really noisy, right? But stop and
Mhm.
think, what is barbecue sauce, right? It's all those things.
Right.
It's got smoke because you've cooked the pork, and I think we don't like things overtly sweet in a main course, but that's we banish them to the end of a meal after the 17th century. Our dessert, and we put sugar and all the spices are now in desserts,
Hmm.
but think of Indian food. That's really the closest living relative. Or think of a mole. That's
Yeah, yeah.
also a descendant in an indirect way through Spain, obviously, but the ground up nuts and fruits, and instead of pepper you have chili and cinnamon and stuff. That's a descendant of these medieval sauces.
For sure. Okay, so this is a fun question about bathtub dining. Would water temperature play a role in the stimulation of libido? I can't imagine a hot water bath being very appetite stimulating. I think that's probably right. I know we sort of think of it as like a hot bath is very
Yeah,
relaxing, but
because
is it also for the libido?
it is for the libido. The hot water melts it and makes it flow more easily. But the idea of like dropping food in the tub and so everything just sounds so
Not so
unappealing to us.
appetizing.
I mean, imagine like taking a chicken leg and bringing it in the shower in the morning with you. It just sounds so bad.
Well, I appreciate the 35% of respondents to the poll who said that heck yes, that bathtub dining is planned for their Valentine's Day. So I wish you good luck with your hot tub dining exploits if you do decide to try to eat the cream spinach or the pork rissoles in the bath. And I think maybe we have time for one last question. Let me find one that is really interesting. Thank you to everyone who typed questions into the Q&A. We're getting so many. Let's see. Do you notice a difference in the text in the treatment of libido between genders? So are there foods that affect men or women more, and or are they the same in terms of
This
recommendations?
is a really, really complicated question because I think it changes when they realize that men and women have different anatomy, and that's with Fracastoro in the 16th century. When that whole, innie and outie kind of theory of gender difference disappears. Up until that point, it's the same thing because both men and women have sperm. It needs to be made in the same way. It needs to become fluid in the same way. It needs to be produced in the same way. When they realize that they're not the same anatomy, they're not analogous at all. They suddenly forget about women. Women don't need stimulation. It's only men, and men need to, and it becomes overtly sexist. I mean, there's no other way to say it.
Sure.
All the way through to, I would argue, even till today. Yeah, right.
Oh, absolutely.
They don't even think about.
So people who are still tuned in, if you did not make the recipes and you're still interested in them, please see the Love, Lust, and Libido event page on the Getty's website, where you can see videos that Ken put together of the instructions for the recipes, as well as PDFs of the recipes. And we would love to see photos of your courtly attire that you wore to this event, or your completed dishes. So you could tag us at Getty Museum or with the hashtag Getty Museum. Thank you all so much for joining us. This has been really fun, and I hope everyone is in the mood for their own Valentine's Day feast later this evening. So thank you all so much.
Thanks, everyone. That was fun.